All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 22, The Early Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1851. We'll be looking at Section 4, New Economic and Political Ideas. So just a quick recap of what we've gone through so far. 22-1 talked all about the causes and origins of the Industrial Revolution. 22-2 talked about specifically the technology associated with it. 22-3 was more about the consequence, or we might say the impact that the Industrial Revolution had, mainly on society. Not just the economy. The Industrial Revolution is surely economic, but it's more than that. It's the impact on society, the impact on people's work lives, social relations, family relations, etc., etc. Here in 22-4, we're going to look at some of the ideas related to it, namely one idea that kind of embraces, you might say, this new industrial system, and then a lot of ideas that are very critical of industrial society. So laissez-faire is a term that means essentially let them do. In other words, that means kind of like a do nothing. So people who advocated for a laissez-faire approach would say about industrial society that it needs very little change or even regulation. Perhaps one of the biggest proponents of this was Adam Smith. He was an economist. And he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which argued for what we might say less or no government intervention, right, in the economy or regulation. And that instead of governments, right, setting things like certain wages or dictating certain trade policies, instead, it would be the invisible hand of the free market. And this is kind of what we want to associate with all these terms here. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, the idea of the invisible hand. The invisible hand is the idea that, supply, that is people who produce things, and demand, people who consume things, they'll sort of naturally figure it out. We want to refer to all this simply as free market capitalism. And, that's what Adam Smith and others of this new industrial system really promoted. This was contrary to the prevailing economic ideology at the time, which was mercantilism. Mercantilism, again, is that economic theory, really from 1600s to about the 1700s, and it was only with this new industrial technology that things started to change, and where free market capitalism and mercantilism really kind of divide is that, again, consider we're taking wealth, for example, right? And these are going to be two pie graphs of all the wealth in the world. Under mercantilism, each country gets their own slice of the pie, meaning that in order for, let's say, Spain to become more wealthy, and wealth was measured in terms of gold and silver, if Spain were to become more wealthy, then one of these nations would have to become poor. So if Spain's slice of the pie grows, let's say to here, well, then we could see that now, at least in this case, Spain has a much bigger piece of the pie, right? They are now a lot more wealthy. And France, which typically, had a slice of the pie that was this big, now only has a slice that is this big. So one country becomes richer, one country becomes poor. And the idea behind mercantilism is that wealth is essentially zero sum. Now here as well, where free market capitalism is different. And that is, let's take the same piece of pie, right? Whatever it is. Again, this is all the wealth in the world. Again, we have Spain here with the largest piece, and we have France here. What Adam Smith essentially said was that, look, if you just let people trade with one another, if you let people freely buy and sell, that is to remove things like monopolies, remove trade barriers, the more people that trade with one another, the pie itself will actually grow. So it's not a matter of zero sum. In fact, when people trade with one another, they both receive something of value. Otherwise, why would you trade? So let's take a historical example, the 13 colonies. It was very common for the English colonists in the 13 colonies to buy French sugar. Under the idea of mercantilism, this was a no-no. And that's why Great Britain passed laws like the Navigation Acts to restrict the British colonists from buying sugar from France, because at least in this theory, England was giving gold, right, via buying sugar to France, making them more wealthy. But of course, under the idea of free market capitalism, the part of the equation that is left out here is that France is providing sugar, right, to England. And so therefore, because the colonists are willingly engaging in that trade, they're willing to give up the gold and the silver for whatever that commodity is, according to Adam Smith, both parties are better off. So rather than this zero-sum game of fighting over resources, Adam Smith says no. The more and more and more that people trade with each other, the actually bigger the pie can get. So you can grow wealth by allowing people to make their own economic decisions. And at least in this case, even if the pie stays the same, you could clearly see that, in the case of France, they're better off. In the case of Spain, they're better off. Everybody is better off, essentially. And, this led to different policies that removed specific monopolies for companies. This led to policies that removed trade barriers that allowed countries to more freely trade with one another. So this idea of laissez-faire, free market capitalism, really coincides with the emergence of the industrial system. However, I would say most of the ideas related to this new industrial system were critical of it. That is, how do we change or improve or actually even just get rid of this new industrial system altogether? A couple of these ideas included the effects that it had on population. Recall that during the industrial period, London grew to the largest city the world had ever experienced. Thomas Malthus said that they would run out of food if population was unchecked. And this was the idea that somehow people need to regulate their reproduction, right? That if the population was left unchecked in industrial society, it just simply grow too large, consume all the resources. There'd be no, food left for anybody, and the human species would cease to exist. If you're familiar with science, this is the bacteria in a petri dish experiment. If you put bacteria in a petri dish, they'll eat all the resources until there's nothing left. And so this led to maybe, again, certain regulations, or at least the idea that there should be certain regulation when it came to demographics or population. Positivism is the idea of scientific management. That very much in the same way that the scientific method built a better understanding of the world around us, positivism was the idea of taking the same scientific method and applying it to society to try to create or build the best society. Again, in that case, there is some sort of intervention or regulation in trying to achieve the best result. But by far, probably the most well-known critic of this industrial free market capitalist system was communism. Communism was founded by Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German. He was a lot of things. We'll call him a philosopher. Philosopher. Pretty sure it's an O. Let me go ahead and check real quick. Yeah, it's an O. Karl Marx was a German philosopher and founded the idea of communism. Right? He is the founder of it. Communism, in short, and again, there's a lot to say about communism, but in short, what Karl Marx stated was that in industrial society, so we might want to say about communism, ultimately their goal is to, we might say, overthrow, or at the very least change industrial society. Right. So according to Karl Marx, essentially there are two classes in industrial society: the proletariat, which is the working class. These are the people who work in the factories, and the bourgeoisie, or the bourgeoisie, who are the factory owners. And Karl Marx talks about how the history of all humankind is based off of class struggle. You know, class is something that's defined by, in most cases, by wealth, right? Material ownership. And Karl Marx talks about how throughout all of human history, dating back from the Roman period to the feudal period, that these various classes have struggled with each other. But in industrial society, there are only two classes, right? Whereas you can look in the feudal period, you know, there were those who pray and those who fight and everybody else and stuff like that. But there essentially is only two classes, and class struggle is the history of humankind. And the idea, and all these ideas were stated in the Communist Manifesto, which was the book which outlined, we'll just say communism. Essentially, that these two classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, trapped in industrial society, where the bourgeoisie is becoming more rich, more rich, more rich, and more rich every day, and the proletariat is becoming more exploited every day, that eventually the proletariat, or the working class, will become so exploited that they'll rise up in revolution and overthrow the working class. They will seize what are called the means of production. The means of production is just a fancy word really for the factories, right? Because it's the factory owners who own the factory. The workers don't actually own it. But according to Marx's ideology, the exploited working class will become so exploited to the point that they'll rise up, they will seize the means of production, and instead of factories being owned by single individuals, they'll be owned communally. That all class differences will cease to exist, right? That there'll be no difference or differentiation between any people. Essentially, everybody will be equal. And it will, you know, bring in some sort of utopia. And if you're not familiar with utopia, it is a sort of paradise, right? It's like this ideal world. And, you know, these ideas from Marx, you know, really beginning in the, you know, 1800s, become very influential around the world. And, you know, some people take to more sort of mild versions, you might say, of communism and trying to create political parties and change the system from within. And then you have the factions of communists who take to violence and destruction and anarchism and bombing and assassination. So in terms of ideologies, in not just maybe recent world history, but maybe all of world history, Karl Marx's ideology of communism is maybe one of the most important from there, and it has its origins in this industrial period. Now, on the ground, there were lots of protests and reforms against this new industrial society. Luddites, many of which were artisans. Recall that an artisan is somebody who makes things with their hands. Right, so these are the people, these were the shoemakers, right, before the industrial period. Now recall, because of the Industrial Revolution, shoemaking as an industry is now on a factory level. Essentially, these artisans are out of a job, right? So they have no job now. And really, you can add to that no purpose. And so they really saw these factories in this new industrial system as a major threat that had to be destroyed. Luddites was the term for people in England who destroyed the factories. Literally, to protect their jobs, burned factories down. You had other revolts that took place in a similar way in places like France, where industrial machines were seen as foreign, they were seen as British, and so they weren't called Luddites in France, but the Luddites essentially in France were more successful in getting some of that industrial technology destroyed or put out. But as try as the Luddites might to want to destroy every single factory, it wasn't practical. It wasn't really going to happen. Instead, what was more successful in the long term was reforms, and there were all sorts of different reforms, most of them centered on wages and the right to vote. Again, depending on what country one is referring to, and we haven't quite gotten to the political revolutions and some of the political changes that take place. But the right to participate in government was not a foregone conclusion. Certainly amongst the working class, at the very least, one would have to have some sort of financial requirement to play some sort of role in the government. But there were some very important reforms. Robert Owen, he was a Scottish factory owner. He became a major advocate of the 8-hour workday. Chartism was another British reform movement. Right? That wanted, so for example, the Chartist movement, they wanted voting rights. That was a big part of it, so that the members of the working class could get into the British Parliament and pass laws that protected the workers. However, more successful in the long run was the union movement. We might call these trade unions or workers' unions. And these were just workers organizing to fight, sometimes literally fight, but not all the time, for better working conditions. Right, and you can think about the union movement as like a strength in numbers. The better the ability for workers to come together and form these organizations, the better they could leverage their strength in order to get shorter work hours. Sometimes it meant passing a law, but sometimes it meant just dealing with the factory worker. A very common tactic by workers would be to go on strike, would be to refuse to work. And that was a way of trying to put pressure on the factory owner in order to get higher wages. However, in Great Britain, there were some laws that were passed that helped to, or started to at least, reform the workplace. So we'll call these British laws. And some of the very first laws, the Factory Act, for example, were concerned with child labor, right? And that was to restrict the amount of hours. So we might just say restrict hours that a child can legally work. The Mining Act did something similar. This was for women and children, right? Limiting the hours. And, that's typically how many of these reform laws were passed, is that first they affected child labor, or they protected children, and then they later on passed to adults. And in other countries around the world, when the process of industrialization takes place, a very similar process is gone through. Great Britain was the first country to industrialize, so some of these reforms were there in the earliest, or there first. In some ways, you could say Great Britain kind of was the experiment, or was the test rat for the industrial period. And then later on, other countries like France, Germany, United States, Belgium, others kind of went through a similar process of exploitation and reform.